I've noticed that this courtyard entry door has a couple areas that I suspect have rot. If the rot isn't extensive, we can repair it now and save the owners a lot of money on a custom replacement door in the future. So let's take a closer look and see what's going on under the surface. After removing the door, you can see there are problem areas that are much larger than expected. Part of the cause was the door was rubbing on a raised area of the walkway. That was removing paint and chipping the edge on the bottom of the door. There's also openings between the tongue and groove panels that all together are allowing moisture to creep in and create the rot. The first thing we're going to do is remove 3/8 of an inch from the bottom here to give the door some clearance. This will also give us a better look at what's really going on with the rot. There's two obvious areas, but there are likely more that can't be seen yet. The top of the door is in good shape with just a couple of tiny gaps I'm going to fill in with caulking to make sure water doesn't penetrate the surface in the future. We'll use the circular saw to make the cut. I've covered the plate with blue tape to avoid making marks and scraping the paint as I cut it. Don't assume that the blade is square because the saw gets banged around sometimes. The depth of the blade only reaches 2 1/8 inches and the door is 2 3/4 inch thick. That's thicker than the average door, so the backside will need to be cut after we flip it over. I'm going to try and keep moving this door to a minimum because it weighs around 150 pounds. You can use a guide here, but this is a last-minute job and I didn't have one in my truck, so I'm just going to freehand it. It takes a little time sawing this, but it's thick hard wood and you want to try and maintain a straight cut over an uneven surface. I'm letting the saw spin down at the end of the cut so I don't make any unwanted gouges removing it while the blade's still spinning. As I'm chiseling off the cut area here on the front of the door, I need to be careful not to hit too hard and bust the surface area off the other side. I don't want to create any other additional damage to the door. It's time to get digging into the rotted areas and excavate every bit of it. Any rot that remains will continue to deteriorate the wood. I'm finally hammering into some solid wood here, but there's still a lot more rot to remove. I want you to see how what looks like it's not so bad actually crumbles with my finger. This is the stuff that's got to come out. This flat area is still good. There's a layer of glue between the two pieces that created a moisture barrier. Down at the other end there's another rot area. Notice how these large areas are in the same location. It seems like the end grain is more susceptible to rot. It's also where there's a joint between the outside tongue and groove boards where there's a hole exposed at the bottom. So I have this area cleaned out and I've got some cut pieces of cedar to glue in and fill the voids. Throughout this video I'll be using these tools. It's a good idea to get them together before you start so the project doesn't get delayed. And don't forget pencils. This board has a crack in it that I'm going to glue and clamp. I'm using this shim to hold the gap open while I add glue. My clamps won't reach far enough inside, so I've screwed that part down with a small trim screw that won't crack the board. Filler will be used for the small gaps. We can mix up the filler now. This rot area goes through to both sides. I'm going to need to clean it out better after I flip the door over to the back side. I've sealed off part of the area with some scrap wood blocks, and I'm just doing this thin gap right now. There's a dam at the end of the boards held in place with some tape so it doesn't spill out. You'll want to get the filler deep inside all the cavities, so push it in the sides well, then fill the top last. You have to work reasonably fast because the filler will begin to set up in a couple of minutes. It doesn't have to be perfect because I'm going to grind it and then sand it smooth. So it's better to be a little bit high above the board, otherwise you'll need to add some more filler. I use a filler that's water resistant and bonds well with the wood. I get it from a professional automotive paint supply store, but it can be ordered online as well. I usually get an extra tube of hardener because I add a bit more to get the filler to set up quickly and sand it faster. The compromise is that you have to work fast before it starts to set up. I like to use the grinder first because it takes the high spots down quickly. Even though it's hardened, the filler surface can be a little bit sticky and loads up the paper on the vibrating sander. Using the grinder first eliminates that problem. The tools we use for this part are a jigsaw, a rotary sander with 120 grit paper, and an angle grinder with a sanding disc attachment and 100 to 120 grit disc. I like this particular grinder because the handle can pivot when I'm sanding something flat versus an edge. Here's the fiberglass filler I'm using. I flipped the door over and you can see where I filled the front side. I'm almost done cleaning this out. Remember this picture of the front side of the door from earlier? The circle on the right is where we just were in the video. The circled area on the left is that tiny bit of filler. But look on the back side of the door at what happened because it didn't properly fill the area and let moisture in. We've got all of the holes filled and sanded now. The last remaining part of shaping the filler is to carve grooves into the repaired areas to match the tongue and groove panels. The way I do this is draw a pencil line that follows the groove by using a straight edge on top of the sanded filler. Then by using a reciprocating saw blade, a deep groove can be cut to match the wood panels. I use the finer one to shape it along with a razor blade which smooths the shape of the edges. Then I can use 120 grit sandpaper to perfect the shape and smooth it out. Any variety of tools can be used to do the shaping. You just have to be creative and don't need any kind of fancy tools to get good results. Once this is all done, we can use the finer reciprocating saw blade to cut a deeper groove at the bottom. I'm doing this so that if the wood swells and contracts, it's less likely to crack the filler off. It's kind of like the joints they use between concrete slabs to prevent random cracks. There's a couple of spots here to add a little filler, so I'm going to do that now, then sand the paint and prime the other side of the door before I come back to deal with a more time-consuming issue with the paint on this side. So I'm going to prime this side of the door now. I've feathered the existing paint and have everything sanded and the grooves carved in here. We've also sanded the sharp edges on the bottom of the door so they're less prone to chipping. I'm going to prime the sides and bottom of the door. There are a few areas that need to be caulked, but we want to prime first because the caulk will have better adhesion. After this side's primed and flipped over, we'll put a second coat of primer on the bottom. I want every bit of this to be sealed. After I flipped the door back to prime the front side, I tried to feather the paint and it kept peeling. It wasn't primed like the back side and comes off in sheets. We're going to have to remove the paint from this section of the door. So I ran a razor along the outside edge and anywhere inside of the door I wanted to stop the paint from continuing to peel into other sections. The door is primed and ready to install now, so I've lifted it onto a drop cloth so it won't scrape any paint off the bottom as I move it around. I've already stacked some shims to prop the door that will raise it up from the ground to the height of where the hinge will be screwed on. This door is heavier than most entry doors to your home, so it takes some extra maneuvering to get it in place. Normally you can just remove the pins from the hinges, but these are ball bearing hinges and the pin is difficult to remove. The screws are 1 5/8 inches long and in solid and deep on the door, so I was able to remove them knowing they would hold the door when they were put back in. I like to take them off the door if possible, as some screws on the jamb can often be holding the jamb in position, and that can create an alignment issue when you're reinstalling the door that you might want to avoid. I have a magnetic screw tip on the screw gun, so I can put a screw on it and install it with one hand, but the hinges and screws here are stainless, so they're not magnetic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a drywall screw that the bit will hold in place initially, so I can do this with my free hand. I'll remove the drywall screw and replace it with one of the larger stainless hinge screws once I get the door held in place. I generally start with the top hinge first, just 2 screws towards the front side of the door. The door is too far forward, so to move it back a little, I need to put a shim on the other end of the door to raise it and move the door back. So now the middle hinge is aligned, and I put 2 screws in there and then repeat the process for the bottom hinge. I can't reach the inner screws on the hinges, so the door has to be open and then they're accessible. When removing the shims from under the door, try not to pull out the top shim in the stack. It can scratch or even chip the bottom. It's better to slide out a lower shim first. Now that the door's hung, I've sanded down any rough spots. The brown staining called tannins from the wood were coming through the paint, but a second coat of primer evened them out. These stains can come through the top coat of the paint if they aren't taken care of at this stage. Once the primer's all dry, it's ready for paint. I used a leftover gallon of paint from the previous paint job. The rot wasn't too visible at first, but with the repairs we made, it'll be around for years to come now and save costly repairs or even a custom replacement door that would have been necessary in the next couple years. Leave a comment if you have questions or want to suggest topics that are helpful to you. Now's also a good time to subscribe so you don't miss new videos on ways to create, build, and fix things in your home. I'm Steve Blackwood. Thanks for watching.